right. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Plant-Based Kidney Health. I'm Michele Crosmer, and I'm a renal dietitian, and I am here with Dr. Sean Hashmi. And we're excited. We're on episode 21, and today we're talking about eggs and dairy and kidney disease. And a lot to talk about. We get a lot of questions on this, so we hope we'll be able to clear up some confusion or answer some common questions that we get. So to start it off, Dr. Hashmi, let's start with eggs. So are eggs something that people with kidney disease can, should, shouldn't eat, and why?
Yeah, so this is where I'm gonna try to cop out a little bit and say it depends. and the reason is because the whole egg thing is incredibly controversial. So for starters, we are more plant-based, which means we push more towards trying to go towards a plant-based diet. But at the same time, we also want to present to you what is the research, not my opinion, not my biases, but to be very clear and give you the data around it. Now, one of the things that we know about eggs in general is eggs are very inexpensive. So they are a food source that is readily available. And so when you look at food choices, especially if you're looking at things like red meats and so forth, you have better options and better opportunity to go towards the egg side than you do going towards the red meat side. And in addition, one of the things that is a selling point for eggs has always been is that they have a high biological value. That's just a fancy way of saying that they essentially give you all your amino acids going on, and they are very proportional in terms of the amino acids there. And then the one thing that people talk about a lot is the fact that when it comes to certain branched chain amino acids, remember branched chain amino acids are leucine, isoleucine, and valine. Leucine is an abundant amount that's found inside eggs going on. And leucine is one of the primary things that's involved in muscle synthesis. So a lot of athletes talk about leucine. We'll talk about the other side of leucine in a minute, but when it comes to the pros on the egg side is really the discussions around leucine, the discussion around biological availability, and the discussion around cost. Now, based on all of those things, egg consumption in the U.S. has actually been rising every single year. In 2008, people were consuming about 248 eggs a year. That's almost one egg every day. And in 2019, that number is up to about 281. And part of that is the readily availability going on. The other stuff when we talk about eggs is eggs are very rich in phospholipids. The specific phospholipid that is found in eggs is phosphatidylcholine. And choline is important for brain function and a lot of things, but choline has a dark side too, and we'll get into that in a second. But on the positive side, what's interesting about choline is that phosphatidylcholine and these phospholipids inside the egg, specifically in the egg yolk, they like to go inside HDL more so than other places. And when they do, they actually increase your serum HDL concentration. And remember, HDL is your good cholesterol. Now, on the flip side is the negative side of eggs. And when we look at the yolk, egg yolk has a concentrated source of phosphorus going on. So you're looking at really a large egg has roughly about 95 or so milligrams of phosphorus in it, versus in the egg white, you only have about 5 milligrams or so. So phosphorus in terms of egg yolks, that's your main source going on. Now with choline, remember we said the yolk is a rich source of phosphatidylcholine. Choline is a precursor for this thing called trimethylamine N oxide. Now, TMAO, which is a short way of saying it, TMAO has an interesting history behind it. There's a lot of data that talks about how TMAO is actually pro-atherogenic, which means it actually builds plaques inside your arteries going on. So it's linked to things like plaque buildup or atherosclerosis. It's linked to clots, and it's linked to heart failure. But more importantly, TMAO is linked to the progression of kidney disease getting worse, and it's linked to worsening of your risk of dying in chronic kidney disease. But here's where it gets really, really confusing. First, choline doesn't always raise TMAO. Second, TMAO doesn't affect all of the worsening of kidney disease in all circumstances going on. In fact, it actually depends on what else the person is doing. So anytime we try to isolate one item and say this is all good, or all bad. We forget the interaction of that one thing with all the other items. That's the same thing in this case with the choline inside the eggs. It may be that the people who are eating the eggs are also eating a ton of bacon and all sorts of fried stuff as part of their meal. And so in the population data that they've looked at, when it looks bad, it's only looking bad because they're doing all these other things. So don't know. And that's why eggs sort of become so controversial. The other part of egg, which is also incredible. I mean, there's so many things controversial about eggs, but the other part of eggs that's so controversial is eggs are a rich source of cholesterol, right? That's the yolk specifically. So the problem there is it's all in the yolk. It's about 11, close to 1,200 milligrams of cholesterol in a large egg. Now, the problem is what's the link between cholesterol and heart disease? Well, this becomes really controversial too, because in the past, all of the guidelines that used to come out, they all used to say a specific recommendation on how much cholesterol you should eat. Those guidelines have changed. Now they don't mention specific amounts of cholesterol because the data has been so controversial going on. So this makes the whole argument of, well, is the cholesterol in eggs bad or not? It depends. So for example, large population studies that have been done in Europe, they show that people who consume an egg a day, they have lower mortality than those who don't. Then there's studies in the US population where people who consume an egg a day have higher mortality. And my answer to that is I don't think it's an ancestry thing. I think it's a lifestyle thing of what other things they're eating, what other stuff they're doing. Now, other stuff in eggs that sort of goes one way or the other is when you look at chronic kidney disease, one of the things that chronic kidney disease patients have a higher risk of is things like glaucoma, things like diabetic retinopathy, is things like age-related macular degeneration. So all of those things are higher risk. And eggs are a very rich source of lutein and zeaxanthin. And the reason that matters is because lutein and zeaxanthin, they tend to accumulate here in your eyes, in the retina going on. And there's data that they may slow the progression of age-related macular degeneration, which if you don't treat, it will go to blindness. So in terms of some of the beneficial stuff, it's in there. It's things like lutein and zeaxanthin. Now, eggs have vitamin D, but it's really a very low concentration. It's not going to make you or break you. The other part of eggs that's important to understand is we talk a lot about renal acid load. And renal acid load is an important marker for how fast your kidneys are going to decline, how fast you're going to go progress to dialysis. Now, eggs actually don't have a lot of acid. So they really don't. Egg whites, for example, are naturally alkaline, while egg yolks have a pH of about 6, but when you put it together, it ends up being very, very neutral and doesn't really add to the acid load. So once again, when you are sticking to this whole spectrum idea, we really want you to go from that other side of the spectrum where the red meat and processed meat is and start shifting this way going on. And so the more you're able to shift, the more you're able to add things like some plant-based proteins, some more fruits and vegetables going on. All of that is going to affect your overall health. And if you end up adding some eggs to your overall health, we're going to talk to Michele in a second about egg whites, but, think about it more in terms of egg whites going on than in terms of eggs going on. But in general, the cholesterol argument, it doesn't hold a lot of water because we don't have a lot of data on it. The choline link with TMAO is very, very controversial. In fact, it turns out that when you look at fish, when you consume fish, you actually generate far more TMAO than when you eat eggs. Yet fish is actually linked to the opposite in terms of lowering the risk of heart disease going on. So the TMAO story is very controversial, but what we have known is that if you eat a diet predominantly rich in meat, you're going to have so much toxins building up that things like TMAO will matter, and all of this stuff will matter. So if you're somebody who says, I like to eat a ton of steak, a ton of bacon, a ton of other stuff going on, and I'm eating eggs, then that eggs will look bad. But if you're somebody who's eating more predominantly plant-based diets and is having eggs, then in that particular case, I don't have any evidence to say that it would be harmful. All right, so with that, let's go, Michele. Let's talk a little bit about egg whites and, how much should they eat, what they eat it with. Let's get into that a little bit.
Yeah. And one thing I was going to say, just because piggybacking off what you've been saying is, and with the TMAO, a lot of research around that, but just things in general with kidney disease and kidney health has to do with gut health. And I think it's important, like you talked about that spectrum and what people are eating it with. And so I even saw a study where they had given like vegans choline supplements to look at levels of TMAO compared with people, who eat meat regularly, and they had higher TMAO after the choline supplement compared to vegans or plant-based eaters. And so a lot of that I think has to do too with like your gut microbes and all that. And like you said, if you're predominantly eating plant-based, there's a different impact from the eggs than if you're predominantly eating an animal-based, and especially a highly processed animal-based diet, and then how those potentially amplify things. So egg whites, and what you mentioned too with egg whites, like you said, so you're obviously not getting the yolk, so you're not getting the cholesterol. Of course, you're not getting, a good amount of the vitamins and minerals, but with the egg whites, you do have a lot lower potential renal acid load. And then you don't have that concentrated phosphorus because you would be removing the yolk. Regardless of whether, so I would say, in general, yes, if you're looking to do the egg whites, then you're going to have lower potential renal acid load, lower cholesterol. You have less of that choline, so potentially less contributing to TMAO production. But it's still important what you're eating it with. If you eat egg whites with bacon, sausage, and fried hash browns, then that's not the beneficial thing. It's overall, whether it's egg whites or the eggs, it's what it's being paired with. And, really ideally that would be fruits and vegetables and getting those in. Those should be part of every single meal that we consume. And so if you're getting, if you can get vegetables in like sauteed or scrambled with your eggs or your egg whites and some fruit on the side, that's going to be a lot better substitution than bacon and sausage and cheese and all these other, where just everything is animal protein, animal product. The other thing too that, and I don't know, or I think we're going to talk about alternatives. We'll talk about egg alternatives later, but that's one of the things that I get asked a lot about. And I don't know if you do, but people will say, okay, well, I'm cutting eggs out. And so then they buy these egg substitutions or like vegan egg substitutions. And unfortunately, a lot of them have phosphorus additives and sometimes other things added to them. And so in general, when we're substituting an animal protein, an animal food, an animal product, we want to be, the benefit of cutting that out is what you're replacing it with. And so really, if we can get a whole minimally processed plant protein source in place of that, that's going to be ideal. And for eggs, usually something like tofu or even using a chickpea flour are things that you can make scrambles or omelets with and include your veggies still. And then it's a plant protein substitution for egg. And so especially something like a tofu scramble, again, you press the water out, you crumble it all up, even adding some like turmeric to it gives it that yellow color. So it feels like an egg. A lot of times people like to use the less firm tofu for eggs because then they get more of that like texture of a soft scrambled egg. So that's always an option. And then again, with the chickpea flour, you usually like a quarter cup of chickpea flour mixed with about half a cup of water, and you mix it up. And again, you can add turmeric to make it yellow like an egg. You can add your seasonings and spices, but now you kind of like pan fry that, and you can add sauteed veggies to it. And now you have an omelet that's technically an eggless omelet, but it's not a store-bought, highly processed vegan substitute that then has other things added to it.
That's excellent. That's excellent. And one other thing to add from an environmental perspective is also keep in mind, because eggs and, dairy and everything is such a major industry, there is a lot of stuff that happens when it comes to, chickens and so forth and eggs and the way that the breeding is done. And even when it says cage free, it's not. So we also, as we talk about kidney disease and as we talk about everything also, this is one planet we live on, and we also want to be kind to the animals around us. And we want to make every effort we can to not leave such a large footprint as we do currently on this planet. And there are so many people out there who are starving and don't have access to stuff going on. And whenever we create absolutes, as in you cannot do this or you can do this, at the end of the day, absolutes don't get us anywhere. It's these compromises, it's understanding that there's stuff we don't know, and being able to see where people are at to meet them where they're at is really, really important.
Yeah, I agree with that. And speaking of things that we do and don't know, what about, let's dive into dairy then, and dairy, and is that something that, including, milk and butter and cheese, or is that something that someone with kidney disease shouldn't consume, or, should just limit?
Yeah, so dairy is very interesting. When you start with milk, for example, milk has over 50 hormones that are all there to help the baby calf develop. So when you talk about milk wasn't designed for humans. It was designed, of course, for baby calf going on. So you want to know that. And the big issue that we run into with dairy products really has to do with the fact that the way the breeding goes with cows is really they're bred to produce higher concentrations of insulin-like growth factor 1, or IGF-1. Now, IGF-1 is linked to things like a variety of cancers when it's present in very high concentrations. So in general, we want to have lower concentrations of things like IGF-1. But in addition to that, because the cows have to be pregnant most of the time in order for them to keep making milk going on, they have very high concentrations of estrogen and progestin going on. And so all of those hormones are the stuff that's also going inside us. Now, whether it's the infant that's getting cow's milk going on or the adult that's getting cow's milk. We talked about leucine before, especially when we're talking about egg whites and eggs in general. And we said, eggs are a good source of protein in the sense that they have a high biological value. They are rich in leucine. So leucine has a double-edged sword. On the one hand, all young athletes, they want to get more leucine because it's linked to muscle synthesis. On the other hand, the problem you run into with leucine is excess amount of leucines, they also activate what's known as the mTOR pathway. And the reason this is, once again, one of those fancy words that you don't need to remember, but mTOR pathway, it's what promotes cells to divide. And it also, the pathway that prevents cells from essentially dying off. So now think of a cancer cell. You don't want the cancer cell to keep dividing, and you want the cancer cell to die. But this is the same pathway that we are trying to stop when we have too much leucine. And that's an excess amounts going on. So that's where you want to remember as another issue. Now, we've talked about in past, when you talk about all dairy products, if you're looking at things like saturated fats, or you're looking at full fat dairy products, we know that saturated fat, correlation, not causation, but is linked to higher risk of spilling protein in the urine going on. So specifically around higher concentrations of full fat milk or full fat dairy and so forth, that's an easier answer because we have data. When it comes to low fat, the problem there is that in population-based studies, there's actually a lower incidence of CKD. But remember, these are population-based studies. So the question is if you go to buy milk and you say, I want to be healthier, so I'm going to get low fat, and I'm going to get more veggies for my kids, and I'm going to do this, this, and this. So is it because that idea of low fat is linked to people trying to make healthier decisions? And is it the idea that people who are not doing that, who are having the full fat stuff, are then eating, the triple cheeseburgers with it, or all of the pizzas every day going on? And that's why you have this discrepancy where high fat, higher incidence of kidney disease versus low fat, lower incidence of kidney disease going on. Now, what's interesting is if you replace red meat with dairy, your risk of heart disease goes down. If you replace dairy with things like polyunsaturated fatty acids like nuts, your risk of heart disease goes down. So as you think about this spectrum, we still have a spectrum where it starts off at red meat, then it goes somewhere middle to things like dairy, then it's like eggs, and then it's going towards more fruits and vegetables. And that's your spectrum. So if you've had dairy, does that make you a bad person? Of course not. But it's one of those things where it is another one of those really, really controversial topics where you have to understand why there's so much confusion, because there's conflicting statements. And unfortunately, oftentimes you'll see quote unquote experts talk only about points that support their argument. They don't try to give you both sides of the story. So If this sounds confusing to you, it's because I'm purposely trying to give you both sides of the story.
It's because it is confusing.
All right, Michele. So let's talk about some vegan alternatives to things like dairy. So what about plant-based milks, vegan cheeses, yogurt, alternatives?
Yeah. So I think one of the great things about plant-based becoming more popular is there are a lot more options. If people are looking for a dairy-free alternative, the bad part of it is that then we get into the realm of, okay, is this becoming this, what's added to it? Is it becoming highly processed? So I think if we start with plant milks and even plant yogurts, both of those, some of the main concerns that you'd want to look out for is phosphorus additives. And again, the reason phosphorus additives are so commonly found in these non-dairy alternatives is because if it's fortified, if they're trying to add calcium to it because they want it to mimic, the calcium that's in cow's milk, oftentimes the form is tricalcium phosphate, which is a phosphorus additive. And so then they're adding calcium, it's adding a phosphorus additive. So that's one of the things you want to look for. There are plenty of options that don't have phosphorus additives. And then there's even the option of making your own plant milk at home. So, and we can get more into that, but ultimately you want to be looking for phosphorus additives, and you do need to look at the ingredient list, and then anything PHOS would be a phosphorus additive. And then you'd ideally want to pick one that doesn't have that. As far as, the other thing is unsweetened varieties. So original, like if you're getting almond milk or soy milk or cashew milk and it's original, it sounds like, okay, this is just original, almond milk, but typically that means it has sugar added to it. And you would see, if you looked at the nutrition label, the grams of sugar, and even in the ingredient list, oftentimes it's cane sugar or something like that that's added. So you would want to get an unsweetened variety. That way you're not getting any added sugar to that milk. And then as far as which one, I mean, most plant milks and most brands of plant milks, they're majority water. So they're not, even though something like almonds, which is a little higher in potassium, almond milk typically is not very high in potassium because it's mostly water. But there's even brands that use a higher amount of nuts, or so ultimately across that, there's like almond milk, there's cashew milk, there's rice milk, there's soy milk. Your soy milk will be higher in protein and potassium, and then your nut milks will usually be a little bit lower. Rice milk is going to be pretty low in potassium, but then it can be higher in sugar, depending on the variety that you get. So ultimately check the label, get an unsweetened variety and one that does not have phosphorus additives. And then same thing for the yogurts, unsweetened is key. I've seen yogurts that have like 20 grams of added sugar in them. It is a crazy, insane amount, whether it's regular yogurt or it's plant yogurt, you want to get an unsweetened variety with no phosphorus additives. As far as some brands, so like for the milks, Simply Almond and Three Trees are two brands that don't have the phosphorus added. Even some silk varieties don't have phosphorus added. And then Forager cashew yogurt and Kite Hill almond milk yogurt, those typically don't have phosphorus additives, but always check the label because the manufacturers can change that at any time. And then cheese, I think, is a big one that I always get asked about. And I think the important thing to remember with this is, sometimes one of the things with cheese is that it's, high in saturated fat and oftentimes high in sodium. Oftentimes that's the case for even the vegan cheese alternatives because they're using a coconut or a palm oil and then they're adding a bunch of salt to it. So you do want to be cautious of that with your vegan cheeses. And then of course, even the phosphorus additives. The best thing would be if you are looking to, okay, I'm trying not to do cheese, then if you can make your own variety of that at home instead of relying on the store-bought one, which is really expensive and usually very salty and high in saturated fat still. So oftentimes that's where people use nutritional yeast, and it's in all sorts of recipes to make like vegan or plant-based Alfredos and Parmesan cheeses. I've made like a vegan feta cheese out of tofu. So again, there's lots and lots of options, but if you can make your own variety of it at home and you control how much salt goes into it, you're not adding added phosphorus to it. Yes, it might take a little more time, but once you find that variety of it that you like, then you can add that to your meals and you still get that cheesy flavor, but it's not coming along with all the salt and the saturated fat. And then you have more control. So I think, again, with that, it's just important is if you're looking to cut out or even just reducing the dairy, all forms of those dairy, then it's important. What are you replacing it with? And we don't want it replaced. If you're just eating a lot of vegan cheese 3 times a day, instead of eating regular cheese 3 times a day, that's not the same as, okay, every, maybe a couple times a week, I'm going to have this in this small portion. And then other times I'm going to make my own plant Parmesan with nutritional yeast and sprinkle that over my food instead.
Excellent. All right, guys. So you got your answers to our continuation of Can I Eat? And so with that, as always, you can send us an email. You can leave your comments behind for future topics so we can go ahead and add those on. And at the end of the day, just remember, life is all about making small choices, progress over perfection. And with that, we will see you next time.
See you guys.